Be careful about what you have been trying not to say, because today may bring a conversation to the surface that has been waiting in the shadows for weeks. You may recognize it immediately. The discussion you keep postponing, the message you almost send and then erase, the subject that somehow never becomes the subject, even though both people can feel it sitting there. Perhaps you noticed a strange pause during dinner recently, longer than an ordinary silence should have been. Perhaps a disagreement 2 days ago seemed strangely intense compared with what was actually being discussed, almost as if the argument was only the visible edge of a much deeper feeling that neither person had found the courage to name. Or perhaps you have sensed someone close to you becoming quieter, more distant, more careful with their words, and you have wondered whether you were imagining the change. You probably were not. This morning, Venus reached exact opposition with Saturn, a transit that has been building since the 19th, and today brings that developing tension to its strongest point. This aspect can create a very particular emotional atmosphere, one where people begin to recognize that something in a relationship can no longer be maintained through silence, habit, or avoidance. If one of your relationships has felt unusually heavy over the last few days, this transit may explain why that weight has been so difficult to ignore. More importantly, the same pressure that makes today uncomfortable can also reveal the truth you need in order to understand what comes next. 5 signs are standing especially close to this test, and each one is being asked to confront a different expression of the same larger question. I will explain exactly who they are and what kind of reality check may be unfolding for each of them. Before you continue, think honestly about your own sign and ask yourself whether someone has felt different toward you during the past 2 days. If you have been watching this channel throughout the past 2 weeks, you already know that this month has not been astrologically quiet. The Lion's Gate opened one layer of the story. The eclipse exposed another. The Scorpio moon just 2 nights ago intensified the emotional atmosphere. And now Venus and Saturn arrive with a test that feels less like a separate event and more like another chapter in an unfolding process. Each event has asked something different from you, yet each has also built upon what came before it. That is important today, because the pressure you feel may make more sense when you stop looking at this moment as an isolated transit and start seeing it as part of a larger sequence of revelations that has been developing since the beginning of the month. Now let us remove the dramatic language that often surrounds Venus and Saturn and look at what this combination actually represents. Venus describes your values, your attractions, your emotional preferences, the way you express affection, and the kind of love and appreciation you hope to receive. Saturn represents structure, time, responsibility, limitation, and consequence. Saturn is associated with a part of life that becomes visible only after excitement has faded and reality has had enough time to reveal whether the foundation beneath something is actually strong. When Venus and Saturn stand directly opposite one another, Saturn is not simply coming against Venus as though one planet is good and the other is bad. The symbolism is much more revealing than that. Saturn is essentially asking Venus to stop avoiding a question. Is what you are experiencing truly authentic, or has comfort been mistaken for security? That question can land very differently depending on the relationship you are examining. If something has been created through honesty, mutual respect, genuine affection, and the willingness of both people to remain present when life becomes difficult, this transit can actually feel reassuring. Pressure does not necessarily destroy something strong. Sometimes pressure proves that it is strong. You may suddenly recognize that what you have built can withstand discomfort without collapsing, and that realization can create a deeper sense of trust than easy circumstances ever could. But when a connection has survived mainly through avoidance, convenience, emotional dependence, or tension that nobody wants to acknowledge, the same planetary pressure can feel much sharper. Today may make the difference impossible to keep ignoring. This is not limited to romantic relationships. The same pattern can appear in a business partnership, where responsibilities have become uneven, in a friendship where emotional effort has stopped flowing both ways, or even in your relationship with your own creative work, when affection for what you create has become tangled with fear, judgment, or the constant need for external approval. Wherever commitment exists without complete honesty about the foundation underneath it, Saturn has a way of increasing the weight until you are forced to notice what has been carrying that weight all along. Family relationships can be especially sensitive because they often contain patterns that have been repeated for years or even decades. Think about a relationship with a parent, a sibling, or an adult child, where everyone understands the rules of the relationship without anyone ever actually discussing them. Expectations may have become so familiar that they feel like facts. One person always gives in. Another person always expects support. Someone remains silent to keep peace. Someone else interprets that silence as agreement. Over time, these arrangements can become deeply rooted, and today can make them feel unusually charged. That does not mean you need to force a confrontation simply because the transit is intense. It does mean you should notice what is being revealed. You may choose to address it slowly. You may need time before speaking. You may decide that observation comes before action. The important point is that the emotional signal deserves to be recognized rather than dismissed. There is also a physical dimension to this transit that can appear before you consciously understand the emotional story behind it. Venus opposite Saturn can sometimes be experienced as heaviness in the chest, a sensation that does not feel exactly like sadness or anxiety, but more like carrying an invisible weight. You may notice tension across your shoulders or find yourself holding your body in a guarded position without realizing that you are preparing for something emotionally demanding. You might become quieter than usual, less interested in filling every silence, more inclined to watch what other people are doing and saying before deciding how much of yourself you want to reveal. These sensations alone are not a reason for alarm. Symbolically, they can reflect the seriousness associated with Saturn, as though your body recognizes that something carries emotional stakes before your conscious mind has found the words to explain it. If you experience that heaviness today, do not automatically fight it with forced optimism. You do not have to convince yourself that everything is wonderful simply because you want to feel better. Sometimes the healthier response is much simpler. You can acknowledge that today feels heavy, and then ask what that heaviness may be trying to show you. There is an important distinction between suffering under pressure and learning from pressure. Saturn becomes more useful when you stop treating its weight as punishment and start treating it as information. There is a traditional astrological reason Venus and Saturn have such a complicated reputation together. Ancient astrologers sometimes described Venus and Saturn as opposing expressions of planetary difficulty, not because either planet was inherently destructive, but because their basic instincts pull in different directions. Venus seeks pleasure, connection, affection, beauty, and emotional ease. Saturn asks for durability, evidence, patience, discipline, and proof that something can withstand time. Venus can say, "I feel this deeply," while Saturn asks, "Will this still be true when circumstances become difficult?" Neither question is wrong. The tension appears because a relationship cannot live entirely on immediate pleasure, but it also cannot survive on endless testing and emotional restraint. When these two principles meet in direct opposition, both sides are asked to mature. Venus must become willing to look honestly at what it loves, while Saturn must remember that not everything valuable can be measured or proven before it is allowed to exist. This particular opposition between Venus and Saturn occurs roughly once every year to 18 months, although the precise timing changes according to the orbital positions of both planets. That means today matters, but it is not a once-in-a-lifetime astrological event. It belongs to a recurring pattern. Understanding that can actually reduce fear, because when a similar transit returns in the future, you may recognize the emotional shape of the experience, instead of assuming that something has suddenly gone wrong for no reason. If you keep a journal, today may be worth recording. Write down what felt different, what conversation seemed unusually difficult, what relationship felt heavier, and what truth seemed impossible to avoid. Later, when another period of relationship pressure arrives, you may discover that the pattern was easier to understand than it felt in the moment. There is another layer of this opposition that deserves just as much attention, because Venus and Saturn can turn their examination inward. Sometimes the relationship being tested is not the one you have with another person. It is the relationship you have with yourself. Venus can describe your sense of worth, your capacity to receive affection, and your understanding of what makes you valuable, while Saturn can expose the rules you have created around deserving those things. You may notice an unusually critical inner voice today. You may wonder whether you are worthy of being loved unless you constantly give more, achieve more, sacrifice more, or prove yourself through usefulness. That is an important realization. If your self-worth depends upon endlessly earning approval, then the foundation is not as secure as it appears. A healthy sense of value does not require you to perform continuously in order to remain worthy. Today's internal version of the test asks whether you can offer yourself the same grounded acceptance that you would expect from a healthy relationship. This can be uncomfortable because many people are far more compassionate toward others than they are toward themselves. You may forgive another person for being tired, uncertain, imperfect, or afraid, while privately demanding that you never show those same qualities. Saturn can expose that double standard. It can reveal where you have confused responsibility with self-punishment and commitment with constant self-denial. Friendships also deserve attention today because the conversation around Venus and Saturn often focuses so heavily on romance that people forget how deeply platonic relationships can be affected. A friendship can contain years of affection, history, loyalty, and unspoken expectations, and that makes it just as capable of carrying imbalance. In fact, friendships can sometimes hide problems longer because they often lack the regular conversations about expectations that romantic partnerships may develop. You might suddenly recognize that you are always the person initiating contact, while the other person simply receives it. You may notice that you are consistently available when they need support, while your own needs remain largely unseen. That does not automatically mean the friendship must end. Saturn does not always demand separation. Sometimes it demands clarity. A direct conversation about what each person expects may be overdue. Perhaps two people who once felt inseparable have slowly become acquaintances, not because of betrayal or a dramatic conflict, but because ordinary life, distance, distraction, and time quietly changed the rhythm of the connection. Today can make that change visible. The real awakening comes when you stop asking only whether a relationship can remain exactly as it was, and begin asking whether the relationship, as it exists now, is honest. That distinction leads directly into the specific signs being placed closest to this Venus and Saturn reality check, because the pressure will not express itself identically for everyone. Do not underestimate the quiet kind of loss that can surface today, because Saturn can make you suddenly recognize how much distance has accumulated in a relationship that once felt effortless. Sometimes there is no dramatic betrayal, no single moment that explains everything, only a gradual thinning of the connection, until you realize that the closeness you once took for granted now requires conscious effort. That realization can hurt in a very specific way. You may remember how naturally you used to talk, how easily you made time for each other, or how certain you once felt that the relationship would simply continue without needing to be maintained. Today's Saturn energy reminds you that meaningful connection does not remain alive through history alone. It needs attention, participation, and deliberate care. The same examination reaches into your professional life as well, because work occupies such a significant part of everyday existence. Think about a business partnership that was created around assumptions instead of clearly defined expectations. Think about a colleague who repeatedly receives recognition while you quietly carry more of the workload. Think about a professional promise made during an exciting moment that seemed completely reasonable at the time, but has gradually revealed itself to be much harder to sustain. Today's transit can illuminate those discrepancies with uncomfortable precision. If something at work has felt strangely wrong recently and you could not identify the source, you may finally understand what has been bothering you. That realization could lead toward renegotiating responsibilities, clarifying expectations, or accepting that a professional arrangement has reached the point where it can no longer continue in its present form. The same question can turn toward your own career and creative commitments. Perhaps you are pursuing a project because you genuinely care about it, but perhaps you are continuing because you once promised yourself you would, and now feel trapped by that promise. Perhaps you selected a career direction years ago and have never stopped long enough to ask whether you would consciously choose it again today. Saturn does not only examine how you relate to other people, it examines what you continue carrying. The central question remains whether the commitment has a living foundation, something you still consciously value and choose, or whether inertia has become stronger than desire. And now we can look more closely at the signs receiving this pressure most directly, because each one encounters the Venus-Saturn opposition through a different emotional doorway. Libra, this transit deserves your full attention because Venus rules your sign, and today Venus stands directly opposite Saturn in an area of the sky strongly connected with partnership. What you normally do so naturally, smoothing tension, finding middle ground, adjusting your position so everyone can remain comfortable, may suddenly stop working as effectively as it usually does. That can feel unsettling because balance is one of your greatest instincts. You know how to read the room. You know when someone needs reassurance. You know how to soften a difficult statement before it creates unnecessary friction. But today's lesson asks you to consider whether keeping the peace has sometimes required you to keep the truth hidden. If you have been quietly compensating for an imbalance, you may become much more conscious of it now. You could find yourself questioning who initiates more, who sacrifices more, who repeatedly changes plans, who apologizes first, or whether the relationship actually provides the mutual fairness you have been trying to believe exists. This does not automatically signal an ending. In fact, some Libras may discover that the relationship is stronger than they feared because genuine fairness has already been present beneath the surface. If both people have been making adjustments and carrying responsibility together, today's pressure can confirm that the foundation has substance. But if you have been carrying the relationship almost entirely through your own flexibility, the difference may become impossible to ignore. Watch one particular habit today. You may begin expressing what you really feel and then immediately weaken your own statement by adding explanations, apologies, qualifications, or reassurances designed to make the other person more comfortable. You may say what hurts you and then rush to explain why they should not feel bad about hearing it. You may identify a boundary and then apologize for having one. That is precisely where today's lesson becomes personal. Kindness does not require you to erase your own position. Compassion and honesty can exist in the same sentence. If you notice yourself softening every truth until it barely resembles the truth anymore, stop for a moment. Breathe. Let the words remain clear. You do not need to become harsh, but you also do not need to apologize simply for being honest. Taurus, because Venus also rules you, today's opposition reaches your world through Venus as well, but your experience carries a different emphasis. For you, the question is less about whether everything appears fair on the surface and more about whether the security you have created can actually withstand reality. Taurus values stability deeply. You want to know where you stand. You want dependable plans, reliable commitments, emotional consistency, and a sense that what you are building will still be there tomorrow. Yet today's transit asks you to look carefully at the source of that stability. Is the relationship secure because the foundation is genuinely strong, or does it feel secure because you have been afraid of what might happen if you disturb anything? That distinction can be uncomfortable for Taurus because remaining still can sometimes feel safer than discovering what change might reveal. Today can bring a quiet examination of shared money, shared plans, shared responsibilities, and emotional commitments. You may not have consciously decided to conduct this review, but circumstances can make it difficult to avoid. Unlike a dramatic confrontation, your experience may arrive as a persistent internal signal. Something keeps bothering you. Something does not quite add up. You may continue with your day while carrying the subtle feeling that a conversation needs to happen. Take that feeling seriously. Taurus is not usually known for reacting impulsively to every passing discomfort, so when a concern remains present and refuses to disappear, there may be something worth examining beneath it. If today's review confirms that the relationship is genuinely stable, the result can be deeply reassuring. There is a particular peace that comes from questioning the foundation and discovering that it can actually support your weight. But if you uncover real weaknesses, be careful not to rely on your natural patience as a substitute for communication. Waiting can sometimes heal circumstances that simply need more time, but when the problem requires another person's participation, more time alone will not necessarily solve it. If the discomfort is pointing towards something real, the answer is likely to involve an honest exchange rather than simply waiting for the feeling to disappear. Capricorn, your experience is especially significant because Saturn rules your sign, which means this opposition places you in a position where the Saturn principle can feel unusually familiar. Libra and Taurus may experience the pressure primarily through Venus, but you may feel more as though you are standing inside the very force asking the questions. that can create a different kind of discomfort, because you may recognize that some of the pressure is coming from your own standards, your own defenses, and your own instinct to remain composed. Capricorn can be deeply uncomfortable with the vulnerability that comes from allowing another person to see what exists beneath competence and control. You have often learned to be dependable. You know how to carry responsibility. You know how to keep functioning when circumstances become difficult. But emotional intimacy asks for something different. It asks you to be visible even when you cannot guarantee the outcome. Today may place you in a situation where you have to decide whether protecting yourself through emotional distance is still serving you. Perhaps someone asks you a direct question. Perhaps their reaction makes you realize that you have been present physically while remaining emotionally guarded. Perhaps nothing dramatic happens at all, and instead you simply recognize that you have been keeping part of yourself safely outside the relationship. That half-in, half-protected position can become much harder to maintain today. The deeper reality check is not necessarily whether the relationship itself is stable. It may be whether you have allowed yourself to fully participate in it. There is an unexpected strength inside this challenge for Capricorn. Saturn is your ruling planet, and that means the very energy creating the pressure is also connected with qualities you already possess: endurance, responsibility, maturity, and the ability to face difficult realities without immediately running from them. You're capable of this examination, even if your first instinct is to postpone the emotional part until you have everything perfectly organized. Today may remind you that emotional honesty does not need to follow a perfect schedule. If someone needs to see more of the real you, trust that you are capable of showing it without losing the strength you have worked so hard to develop. Cancer, your experience carries another layer, because today's opposition places you in tension with both sides of the planetary story. Venus calls for closeness, affection, and emotional connection, while Saturn demands that you confront what that connection actually requires from you. Cancer tends to experience relationship pressure deeply and physically. You may feel a tightening through your chest, a restless sensation that seems to come from nowhere, or a profound tiredness that makes ordinary interactions feel more demanding than they normally would. For you, today's reality check frequently centers on emotional labor. Who has been carrying everyone else's feelings? Who has been calming the situation? Who remembers what everyone needs? Who notices when someone is struggling? And while you have been doing all of that, who has been noticing what you need? You may suddenly realize that you have become responsible for maintaining emotional peace in a relationship, while your own feelings have been pushed further and further into the background. The important point is that today's transit does not require you to repair the entire pattern immediately. Awareness itself is significant. Once you can see the imbalance clearly, it becomes much harder to unconsciously repeat it. If you are the person who needs to have the difficult conversation, do not assume you need to become colder or tougher in order to handle Saturn. Your greatest strength today may actually be the tenderness you naturally carry. You do not need to abandon your sensitivity in order to speak honestly. You can tell the truth without turning your heart into armor. Pay particular attention to your body, because Cancer often experiences emotional tension before consciously identifying its source. Unusual exhaustion, changes in appetite, or the sensation of feeling emotionally saturated may accompany the weight of this transit. Give yourself permission to slow down and rest when your system asks for it. Physical depletion is not evidence that you are emotionally weak. Today's pressure is genuinely demanding for water signs, and responding to that demand with care does not mean you are avoiding the conversation. It means you are creating enough internal space to face what the conversation is actually asking you to acknowledge. That recognition leads naturally into the next layer of today's Venus-Saturn test, where the remaining signs begin confronting their own specific form of truth. Aquarius, today's Saturn influence may feel strangely familiar, almost as though you have been asked to stand in this exact emotional landscape before. Because Saturn co-rules your sign, the kind of pressure arriving now is not completely foreign to you. Other people may experience the weight of this opposition as something sudden and difficult to understand, while you may recognize the sensation almost immediately, even if you would rather not admit how familiar it feels. Your central question today revolves around something deeply connected to your nature, the delicate line between preserving your independence and allowing yourself to experience genuine emotional closeness. You value freedom, personal space, and the ability to remain fully yourself inside any relationship, and there is nothing inherently wrong with that. The question Saturn raises is more precise. Has your need for independence remained a healthy boundary, or has it gradually hardened into a barrier that keeps people from reaching you? That distinction can become impossible to overlook today. Some Aquarians may discover something reassuring, that the relationship they are in actually has room for both intimacy and autonomy, allowing closeness without demanding the surrender of individuality. For others, today's pressure may expose a different reality, a connection where emotional closeness has repeatedly been presented as a threat to independence, forcing you to believe that you must choose between being free and being truly connected. Neither realization is something you should fear. Both are useful because both bring you closer to an honest understanding of what the relationship actually is. What matters most today is not whether the answer is comfortable, but whether it is real. There is another part of this experience that Aquarius should take seriously, and it is the quiet loneliness that can sometimes hide underneath extreme self-sufficiency. Independence can feel empowering when it is chosen freely, but when protecting your autonomy becomes so important that nobody is allowed close enough to truly know you, independence can slowly transform into isolation. You can be surrounded by people and still feel emotionally alone. You can be committed to someone and still feel as though there is a glass wall between you and the person beside you. If an honest look at your inner world today reveals that kind of loneliness, do not dismiss it as simply being who you are. Your need for space and your need for connection are not enemies. They were never meant to cancel each other out. The problem begins when a boundary becomes so rigid that it functions like a wall. Today can help you recognize the difference. And remember, the people around you may also be moving through their own version of this pressure. If someone you care about seems unusually withdrawn, distracted, silent, or emotionally unavailable today, they may be carrying something they have not yet found words for. You do not have to identify the astrological reason or demand an explanation from them. Sometimes the most meaningful support you can offer is simple patience. Notice the change. Give the person enough room to process what they are feeling. Do not immediately interpret their silence as rejection or force them to explain themselves before they are ready. A little understanding can go much further today than another demand for certainty. And if your sign is not among the 5 receiving the strongest emphasis, that does not mean you are untouched by the Venus-Saturn opposition. Everyone can encounter some expression of this energy through their relationships today, although the intensity may be less concentrated. You might notice a conversation suddenly becoming more serious than you expected. You might realize that a boundary you have postponed expressing now needs to be spoken clearly. You might look at a particular relationship with greater realism and finally see its present condition without allowing memory, hope, or habit to distort the picture. As your lesson today may arrive through a situation that asks you to slow down and exercise patience inside a relationship, even though waiting and restraint may not be your preferred response. Gemini, something you have been discussing casually could suddenly require a much deeper and more serious conversation than you originally anticipated. Leo, someone close to you may need reassurance, and today's lesson asks you to stop long enough to provide that reassurance completely, instead of assuming they already know how you feel. Virgo, your natural desire to correct, organize, improve, or repair a relationship may encounter the realization that not every emotional problem can be solved through fixing, and some situations require acceptance instead. Scorpio, something your intuition has already been whispering about a relationship, may receive confirmation through an external event or conversation today, turning an internal suspicion into something you can no longer dismiss. Sagittarius, your instinct to remain hopeful and optimistic about relationships may encounter Saturn's more sober perspective, and although that realism could initially feel restrictive, it can ultimately help you see the situation with greater clarity. Pisces, pay close attention to boundaries within one particular relationship today, because maintaining those boundaries may feel more difficult than simply agreeing to what keeps things easy, yet the discomfort of protecting your limits may be necessary. Knowing which signs are receiving the strongest influence can be interesting, but that information is not the most important lesson available today. The deeper question is how you respond when the pressure arrives. This transit tends to reward honesty, patience, and deliberate communication, while avoidance tends to make the experience heavier. If you are the person who needs to bring up something difficult, resist the temptation to bury the truth underneath so many soft words that the other person cannot understand what you are actually asking for. You do not need to be cruel. You do not need to become emotionally cold, but you do need to be clear. Saturn responds much better to direct communication than to endless diplomatic uncertainty. A truth spoken with respect can be uncomfortable, but it gives both people something real to work with. A vague statement designed to protect everyone's feelings may actually create more confusion because nobody knows what was truly meant. If you're instead receiving difficult information today, try not to rush immediately into defense mode. You may feel the instinct to explain yourself, justify your behavior, correct the other person's interpretation, or immediately prove that they are wrong. Give yourself a moment before doing any of that. Listen all the way through. Let the words reach you before deciding how you feel about them. Saturn favors maturity, and maturity sometimes means allowing an uncomfortable truth to exist in the room without immediately trying to eliminate the discomfort. These conversations are often more productive when both people slow their pace instead of desperately trying to restore emotional comfort as quickly as possible. What you should be especially careful about today is avoidance. Delaying a conversation that you already know needs to happen rarely makes the underlying issue disappear. It usually gives the tension more time to grow. Saturn has a reputation for bringing neglected realities back into view, and the longer something important remains unaddressed, the more difficult it can become to pretend it does not exist. At the same time, do not make the opposite mistake and decide that every heavy feeling means something must end immediately. A difficult day does not automatically equal a broken relationship. Some relationships truly do need to close, and today's clarity may help reveal that. But emotional heaviness by itself is not proof that separation is the correct answer. Sometimes honesty feels heavy before it becomes freeing. Sometimes the first moment of truth feels worse than the silence that came before it, simply because silence allowed everyone to remain inside familiar patterns. If you are preparing for a difficult conversation, there is a simple approach that can create more stability before the discussion even begins. State why the conversation matters. You do not have to make a dramatic announcement. You can simply establish that there is something important you want both people to understand and that your intention is to genuinely hear one another. That kind of structure can be especially helpful under Saturn because clear purpose creates a container for difficult emotions. Instead of beginning with accusations, confusion, or scattered frustration, you create a shared understanding that the conversation has meaning. And if everything does not get resolved today, do not interpret that as fate. Some issues have been developing for much longer than the current transit, and expecting one conversation to repair years of accumulated emotion can create unnecessary pressure. Saturn often works through gradual progress. Today's discussion may simply open a door that needs to remain open. You and the other person may need another conversation after you have both had time to think. That is not a sign that nothing changed. Sometimes the most important breakthrough is simply that something which was previously unspoken has finally entered the conversation. There is also something important to understand about what this Venus-Saturn opposition is not. It is not a guaranteed breakup signal. It is not a cosmic verdict that determines the future of your relationship without considering your choices. It does not mean that Saturn has arrived to decide who stays and who leaves. The symbolism is much more useful than that. This transit applies pressure so that you can see the foundation beneath a relationship more honestly. If the foundation is genuine, the pressure can actually strengthen your confidence in what you have created. You may walk away from today feeling more secure because you have seen that the relationship can survive an uncomfortable truth without falling apart. You may realize that the connection is based on honesty rather than fantasy, mutual effort rather than convenience, and real commitment rather than fear of being alone. That can be deeply validating. But if today's pressure reveals cracks that have been quietly spreading for some time, discovering them now is still valuable. It may hurt to see them, but recognizing a weakness gives you the opportunity to respond honestly instead of continuing to build more of your future on top of something that was already unstable. There is a larger way to understand Saturn that can completely change how this transit feels. Popular astrology often portrays Saturn as the planet that restricts, punishes, delays, or takes things away. Older astrological traditions offered a more nuanced interpretation. Saturn can be understood as a demanding teacher, one whose lessons are difficult precisely because they are meant to remain with you. The discomfort is not necessarily cruelty. Sometimes the purpose of the pressure is to prevent you from spending years investing your energy into something that cannot support the future you want. Saturn asks you to examine what is real before you give more of yourself to it. If something lacks a foundation, discovering that reality now can ultimately spare you from carrying the same weakness much farther into the future. And if something is strong, Saturn gives you the opportunity to discover that strength through experience rather than assumption. That is the deeper gift inside today's pressure. The lesson may not be about losing something at all. It may be about finally seeing what you truly have, and that realization is what carries us into the next part of this story. If the emotional atmosphere today feels heavier than you expected, do not automatically interpret that discomfort as a sign that you are doing something wrong. There is another way to understand what you are experiencing. Sometimes difficulty is the evidence that an important lesson has finally become impossible to ignore. Saturn energy can feel restrictive when you look at it only as something standing in your way, but the experience changes when you recognize that the pressure may be revealing something you need to understand before you move forward. That shift in perspective can make a difficult Saturn transit far more meaningful because you stop asking how quickly you can escape the discomfort and start asking what the discomfort is trying to teach you. For those who are currently single, today's Venus-Saturn opposition still has something important to reveal, even without another person standing across from you. This can become a deeply useful moment for examining what you genuinely want from a partnership, not what you think you are supposed to want. Not what would appear impressive to other people. Not what would make your life look complete from the outside. What do you actually need in order to feel respected, emotionally secure, understood, and genuinely connected? Saturn favors that kind of honest self-examination because fantasy can be comforting, but clarity gives you something solid to build upon. You may discover that some of your expectations around love were inherited from other people, shaped by past experiences, or created from fear rather than desire. Even if nobody else hears the conversation happening inside your mind today, that conversation still matters. Before you move toward another relationship, it can be powerful to understand what you are truly choosing and what you are simply hoping will fill an emptiness you have not yet examined. And today's transit becomes even more meaningful when you place it inside the larger astrological sequence that has been unfolding throughout this month. This moment did not appear by itself. The eclipse on the 12th opened something that had previously been waiting beneath the surface. 2 days ago, the Scorpio moon brought hidden emotional material into greater awareness, making certain truths harder to ignore. Yesterday's Sagittarius moon created a noticeably different atmosphere, bringing relief, optimism, and a sense that movement was finally possible again. Then today arrives with Saturn asking a more serious question. Is the forward movement you are feeling actually supported by something stable, or did the excitement of the last few days make you move faster than the foundation could support? This does not mean Saturn has arrived to destroy your optimism. The purpose is almost the opposite. Saturn is asking whether your optimism has enough reality underneath it to survive once the initial excitement fades. You can be hopeful and still be discerning. You can believe in what is possible while also checking whether the structure beneath that possibility is strong enough to hold what you want to create next. That is the deeper purpose of today's pause. Before you build higher, look underneath. Before you commit more deeply, understand what you are actually committing to. Before you decide that something is the future, make sure you have looked honestly at the present. And there is an important transition waiting immediately beyond today. Tomorrow, the Sun conjuncts the South Node in Leo, opening a period that astrologers associate with release, completion, and consciously letting go of what has already fulfilled its purpose. It is about clearing space for what the eclipse 3 weeks ago began to open. That makes the sequence between today and tomorrow particularly meaningful. Today's clarity can become tomorrow's release. Whatever you recognize today about the authentic foundation of a relationship, a commitment, or a passion can directly influence what you decide no longer needs to be carried forward. If today's examination shows that something is healthy and worth preserving, that knowledge becomes part of what you consciously choose to protect. If it reveals something that has already run its course, tomorrow's energy may help you loosen your attachment to it rather than continuing to hold on simply because letting go feels unfamiliar. One day asks you to see clearly. The next begins asking what you are willing to release because of what you have seen. That is why the emotional sequence matters. Nothing is happening in isolation. Before we move beyond this moment, tell me which of today's 5 highlighted signs felt closest to your actual experience. If your sign was one of the other 7, tell me what your own version of this Venus-Saturn test looked like. Did you notice a difficult conversation, a boundary, a realization, a change in someone's behavior, or a sudden understanding about where a relationship truly stands? Your experiences matter because astrology becomes much more meaningful when we compare the symbolic pattern with what people are actually living through. If you find value in exploring these transits by understanding the mechanism before turning toward dramatic predictions, consider subscribing so you can recognize these energies while they are unfolding instead of trying to understand them only after everything has already happened. If something in today's message reflected what you have been experiencing, support the video and share it with someone who may need encouragement to finally approach a conversation they have been postponing. Whatever becomes visible today, give greater trust to what is real than to what is merely comfortable to believe. Reality can survive honest observation. A connection that has genuine substance does not become weaker simply because you look at it clearly. And something that collapses the moment you stop protecting it from scrutiny may have been depending on avoidance for longer than you realize. There is one final perspective worth carrying with you after this particular date has passed. Saturn transits return throughout life in different forms and through different areas of experience. But beneath all of those variations, they repeatedly return to a similar question. What are you building, and what is actually holding it up? Learning to welcome that question instead of fearing it can become one of the most valuable ways astrology contributes to personal awareness. Eventually, the truth tends to surface. It can appear inside a relationship, inside your understanding of your own worth, or inside a commitment you have continued making without stopping to examine whether you still believe in it. Today's transit does not create that truth from nothing. It gives you a specific moment in time when you have an opportunity to face what was already developing with greater consciousness and a clearer understanding of why the pressure is appearing now. That awareness can prevent you from being blindsided by something you were already sensing underneath the surface. Thank you for staying through this entire exploration and for giving yourself the space to consider something that may not have been easy to look at. Whatever conversation today brings forward, whatever realization becomes impossible to dismiss, remember that you do not have to become someone else in order to meet it. You can face the truth as the person you are right now. You can be honest without becoming cruel. You can be vulnerable without becoming powerless. You can acknowledge what hurts without assuming that pain means you have failed. And if you are watching this after today is already past, remember that the influence of Saturn does not simply vanish the moment the exact degree separates. What surfaced around this date may continue settling into your awareness for another day or two, allowing the emotional meaning to become clearer gradually instead of demanding instant resolution. Give yourself the same patience you would naturally offer someone else who is trying to understand something difficult. You do not have to solve everything before tonight for today's experience to matter. A conversation may have begun without reaching a final answer. A realization may have appeared without immediately changing your circumstances. A truth may have been acknowledged without yet knowing what action will follow. That still counts. Sometimes the most important work of a transit is not producing an immediate conclusion. Sometimes it simply places the first seed of honesty into the ground. What happens because of that seed during the days and weeks ahead may matter far more than anything you manage to settle within the first 24 hours.